Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Nancy McCaughey. McCaughey, did I get that right? Cool.
Got that right.
Yeah. She's a fellow adoptee, like pretty much all of our guests at the moment. And you're a late discovery adoptee. So it was 30. You were 37.
Yeah. Right.
When you found out.
Yes.
And you said that you had this sense of something that you lost. You were thinking about, that what you lost with this news, with this bombshell. Was it a bombshell?
Oh, it was complete bombshell. Yes.
So there was a sense of what you'd lost, but there was also a part of you that still the same, right? So I thought, wow, that's a great starting off point for the conversation, right? So Can you tell us more, please?
Yeah, so when I think about that, Simon, I think about the weekend that I discovered that I was adopted, and it was at my 20th high school reunion. I was living in San Francisco, and I was raised in a suburb of Chicago, Park Ridge. And I missed, I missed my 10th anniversary or reunion and decided to go to my 20th, a little bit reluctant to do it, but then decided, oh, well, what the heck, and met a friend, my best friend growing up. And ironically, she had the same birthday as I did. So wow. we had shared birthday parties together. We had known each other as far back as we can remember. And that weekend, we hadn't seen each other for about 18 years. And she pulled me aside and said, can we talk about something? There's something I've been wanting to ask you. And I said, sure. And so we left the party. We were over in this dark bar that was kind of a cordoned off part of the restaurant. And she just said, how did you feel when you found out? And I said, found out about what? And she said, when you found out you were adopted. And that was the moment that I learned, not the way that I would expect. And it was devastating. It was, at first, it's disbelief, of course. Can't be me. You got to be talking about somebody else. And then, I was probably in shock the whole weekend. And she and I were staying at my mother's house. And my mother was very excited about us being together again and being, back for the reunion. So she wanted to know every detail. So I had to avoid her the whole weekend. I just couldn't face talking to her. It was devastating. And more importantly, I think when your identity is taken away from you in that moment that somebody gives you that information, if you don't have a story to replace it, you're really floating. You have no grounding. It's like, okay, I'm not who I've always been, but who am I? And I have nothing. And maybe, there were feelings of, I may go out of this world never knowing who I am, which was really frightening to me. But the reason I say that is because that flight from San Francisco to Chicago, I was who I was, right? I had an identity. I was 37. I was a mother. I was a wife. I was, a marketing director for a travel company. I am who I am. I knew who I was. But on the return flight, I wasn't the same. And I had to sort out what part of me is still me, my essence, and what part of me have I lost? And what part of me don't I know? So I think that that's pretty common for late discovery adoptees, because we've lived with an identity for so long, we've taken it for granted. And then, that's just who I am kind of feeling. And then when you realize that you're from someone else. You may be from another part in the world that ancestry that you don't know your connection anymore. It's, well, let me say, when I came back to San Francisco, I realized I didn't know anyone who was adopted, I thought, and I had never talked to anyone about adoption. So I had no one to talk to. And if you're the secret, for me, I had to be really careful who I was talking to. So I decided that I would go to Barnes and Noble bookstore and try to find a book that would explain what was going on. And needless to say, there weren't a lot of books on LDAs at the time. It's 1991. And I ended up picking out a few things. And I think it wasn't Nancy Verrier's Primal Wound, because that wasn't out yet, but Betty Jean Lifton, Journey of the Adopted Self.
Yeah.
And anyway, I picked a couple of books out that I hoped would just give me some sense of what it means to be adopted, and went to the counter, and there was a red-haired young man who looked at my books, and then, it was a cash register at the time, and he was ringing up the books, and I wasn't saying anything. I couldn't stop crying. For days I'd been crying. So I wasn't really chatty. And he said to me, "I'm adopted," out of the clear blue. And this is just when I'm feeling like I don't know anyone who's adopted. And this person just, out of the clear blue. So I said, I didn't say anything, actually. He went on and said, "But I've always known," which I often hear from people who haven't always known from birth. They always say, "I'm an adoptee, but I've always known." It's so funny. It's just kind of, whether they know I'm a late discovery adoptee or not. That's often what I hear adoptees say. And for me, that wasn't the case, right? So I'm listening to a story, and he said, I don't have a real desire to know my birth parents, but, I do want to know my medical history. And he's just, musing to himself. And I'm going, okay, I haven't even thought that far, And so he's telling me what it's like. And he said, I love my adoptive family. I've had everything I need. But he said, I think if I was like in my 30s or 40s and found out I was adopted, I think I'd feel like the ground was just pulled out from underneath my feet. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's exactly that. Those words were the words I couldn't identify. Like, I literally felt like a knife was in my stomach, and my stomach was open. It was a physical, it was grief to that level. And I think for him to give me the words of saying, "Oh, that's what I'm experiencing," was really a godsend. I mean, I truly believe, and I hear this from so many adoptees and late discovery adoptees, how synchronicity is such a big part of our story, which I think needs more attention because there were synchronicities that happened that were beyond imagination. Like, I couldn't make it up. And there were probably about 3 or 4 people that just dropped in my life instantly, talking to me about adoption or had some connection to adoption, or after 37 years of never talking about adoption. So, I don't know. That to me says there is something going on. There was an opportunity for me in my life to really pay attention, and I could have been asleep and said, "I'm not going to let this destroy me." And I think I did say, "I'm not going to let this destroy me," but I couldn't do that without doing the work to find out what my identity was and to come clean with my family, because I wanted to know why my mother didn't tell me. I mean, it was almost scary to think that maybe there's a reason that's so bad that she wouldn't tell me, because we were so close. She loved me so much. I loved her so much. I couldn't imagine that there had been a secret for my whole life. And I think that was probably the most devastating part for me. So that
Yeah.
was the home, was that sense of, okay, what part of me has changed? And is there a part of me that's still true, that being adopted can't change? So for me, it was spiritual. It really was. And I don't mean that in a religious sense, but just more of that sense of, why are we here? What, was my life meant to be? I don't know. I mean, I think we all ask that as human beings. And when you're adoptee, you really know that, and especially me, because I was, or people adopted in my birth years. I mean, it was the 50s. There was no there really wasn't abortion. I mean, if it was back alley.
Yeah.
So my mother really didn't have a choice. But then, you think if she did, I wouldn't be here, so there was a sense of gratitude for her to be that strong and courageous, to be pregnant, unwed. Yeah, at that point I was 37, I was already a mother. So I knew what it was like to carry a baby to term and deliver. And that is not for the faint of heart. And, she did that and gave me life. So I didn't know the circumstances, but I had to understand that from a woman's point of view, that, yeah, I have my life because of her. And I have my life because of my adoptive mom too. I say one gave me life and the other one taught me living. So maybe it took two of them to get me where I am. I don't know.
Yeah. That grounding, the loss of grounding is something I've heard from other late discovery adoptees. But what it seems like is like a real, this mix of very painful feelings and very painful thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it went on for weeks. I would cry for no apparent reason. I couldn't stop crying. It just, and I mean, I would sit in my office and sob. And it was just it was so confusing and so concerning. And when you're going through that really acute period is what I call it, when you don't have answers and you don't know who you can talk to and you feel like you're the only person it ever happened to. I think those are the worst weeks. It's truly such a deep, profound loss. And I think some people get it and some people don't. As I've talked to people who are not adopted, either they're going, "Are you kidding me?" And they want to hear the story and they try to imagine what it would be like for them to go to their reunion and have a friend tell them that they're adopted, at that age. And then other people like, "Well, did it really matter? You had a good home, you were loved." Oh, that can happen so often. There's so much lack of empathy and compassion. But I think it's because people who say that have not experienced it. And then there's some people that can without experiencing it. So,
yeah.
But it was a roller coaster. I'd say it was about 2 months that I had to make a decision if I was going to tell my mother. My ex-husband was my husband at the time, who is now an ex-husband, said to me that he wrote me a 5-page letter that weekend when I told him what had happened. And when I got home, he handed me the letter and it was handwritten, all these reasons. I think there were 5 or 6 reasons why I should never tell my mother. that I knew that I was adopted. And, to the point where you may give her a heart attack. I mean, she loved you so much, and walk through all of the things that, I needed to process myself, but he was trying to just put a Band-Aid over it and, just go on as though nothing happened. And I couldn't do that. I didn't think I could ever live the rest of my life with my family without them knowing that I knew. I mean, it would be a charade.
Yeah.
So that actually was another reason that I ended up getting divorced, because it was that kind of control. I don't think he wanted me to be that distracted by it. He didn't want me to be hurt or devastated or any kind of negative experience from it. But that, you can't protect somebody like that, or prevent them from going through what they need to go through to process it.
So what was it that, was there something that marked the end of the acute period?
Yes, the decision to tell my mother. And she called me up one night and said, I want to come out for your birthday. And it was September 28th, 1991. And I knew the day was going to come because I was in San Francisco, she was in Chicago. And, so I did have a period of time away from her that I could really see a therapist, try to figure this out. What did I want to do? What was I going to do? I wasn't ready to tell my son, who was 12 years old at the time. He'd gone through a divorce. I'd been married once before, and my son was from that marriage. So I just didn't want to have to tell him that his grandmother wasn't his grandmother, and so then there's that guilt of, but I'm perpetuating the secret, right? So I was going to tell him, but I needed time to find the right time. And so that's kind of ironic, actually, what I just said. The end of the acute period was telling my mom when she came out that weekend. And my first question to her was, why didn't you tell me? And she said, because it was not the right time. There was never the right time. And she really meant that in a lot of ways. My adoptive father, died when I was 8. He dropped dead of a heart attack at work. So I was raised pretty much fatherless, and in a household of mostly women, except for my brother, who's 5 years older, who was naturally born to my parents. But at the time, I didn't know that. And I was raised with my mother and my grandmother, and we were very tight. But I can see they planned to tell me when I was 10, and I could understand how she couldn't tell me 2 years after losing my father that, oh, by the way, you're adopted. And in the 50s, it was so much stigma. That's why they wanted to wait till I was older. But there were many times when she should have told me, when I had my own son, when I was pregnant, when I was an adult. I think she should have told me younger, but that was, at the time, nobody was doing that. They didn't think that was the best thing to do. So I've got to give her grace for that. There's a lot of norms and pressures that I can remember, but I can't imagine what it would be like to live at that time and be in that situation. So
when did this question come to you in terms of, what have I got left? What have I got that's still the same? That part of me that's still the same. When did that question?
Well, on the flight home, literally, I went to O'Hare Airport, pretty large airport in Chicago. Yeah. And I tried to get out of the house as early as possible during the reunion weekend to fly home, because I didn't want to have any time where I was spending with my mother, because I thought I'm going to just burst out in tears. So I went to the airport early, and I sat in a part of the airport that was darkened because it was so early in the morning. And I had hours to wait. And I really literally remember looking at my hands and wondering whose hands they were, because my grandmother was such a big part of my life, not always good, but part of my life. And she was amazing. She could make anything. She crocheted, she sewed, she made hats, she cooked anything, she baked anything. She could do anything with her hands. And I watched her as a little girl growing up, always wondering if I had her gifts, and I wanted to be like her. And my mom didn't have any of that. My adoptive mom, as it turns out, didn't have any of her mother's talents. But I seemed to be picking them up. So I always thought I had Nana's hands.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's that kind of moment that you go, what, even my hands are from someone else. Who do I belong to in the world? And people would walk by me, that could be my mother, that could be my brother. And I may never know. So that was the time that was the worst. But once I made a decision to tell my mother, I found out, and we had this very long conversation. I stayed home from work and we talked all day and all night. Then I began, that's what I needed to do to be able to begin my search. And it turned out that my adoptive mother had seen my mother's name when she picked me up at the hospital. So there was a file that was open on the counter. It was upside down, and it was my birth mother's patient file. And my mother saw it, and she read my birth mother's name upside down, and she wrote it down on a piece of paper and put it in her lockbox so she would never forget it. And it was Donna Gidley. And she told me that day, when I told her that I had found out, she said, "What do you want to know?" And it's, pretty much everything that you know. And within a couple of minutes of that conversation, she said, "Your mother's name is Donna Gidley." And, at that time, this was pre-internet, pre, computers and email. And I was born in Illinois. That was a closed, sealed state, closed adoption, sealed state. It was done privately for me. So there were no social service agencies involved that there could be a file for. So, of course, I didn't know all of this at the time. I actually had to learn about it. So I attended a group called Alma, which has been in business for a long time. I don't hear that much about it anymore, but I believe it still exists. And it's for adoptees and birth parents who are searching for one another. And they gave me a lot of information on how to think about it, how to decide what I would need to do. How do you find out your identity when the state has sealed everything up? And that was the part that was so amazing, because all I had was her maiden name, and probably she would be married by now, and who knew if she was in Chicago anymore. So I was really looking for a Donna. That's not much to go on.
No.
It was a lot of failed attempts at trying to try to get my birth certificate or my adoption file or something. And it turned out that, it's a long story, but the end of the story is it was the day after Christmas, and I was watching Sally Jesse Raphael, talk show host on TV, who was known for her big red glasses. And I was always working, so I never listened to this talk show before. And I was still married at the time. And I was feeling pretty sorry for myself, because Christmas had come and I still hadn't found my birth mother. And so I decided to stay home from work, and I'm curled up in this recliner watching the TV. And Sally Jesse Raphael is bringing this young woman as her guest on stage. And her production team had found this girl's father, who she had never met, who was a match for her for a bone marrow transplant. It was a phenomenal story. And I was just sobbing. You know, this young girl was seeing her father for the first time. And I, you know, of course, that's all I wanted at that point. And it turned out that my ex-husband said, I think this is an omen. And I said, well, I don't think it can be an omen. There's nothing left to be able to find her. And then I thought, no, there's one thing I haven't done. And it was a list of phone numbers from a Chicago phone book. They're different phone books for different parts of Chicago. And the one that had my mother's name in it, or had my relatives in it, was from the north side. I had been looking on the south side where I was born. So I looked at that list, and my mother had given me the list of numbers from that phone book. And I started calling. And it turned out that the first one on the list was my uncle. And when I asked, by any chance, would you know of a Donna Gidley? He said, because his name was Dennis Gidley. And he said, who is this? I went, oh God, he knows, he knows a Donna Gidley. Of course, I don't know if it's the Donna Gidley I want. And I said, I'm Nancy Decano. That was my married name at the time. I said, you wouldn't know me. And he said, well, why are you looking for her? And I had to absolutely make up a story in the moment, and said I was given her name for a surprise birthday party. And I don't know her, but I was asked to try to find her because my mother knows her. And I'm just like, shaking inside because I don't lie well. Yeah. And then here I'm making up a story. And so he said, well, she's not Donna Gidley anymore. She's Donna Hoffman. She's married to Sheffield Hoffman from Glencoe, Illinois. And I'm just writing this all down as fast as I can. And that's how I found her. Called her the next day. And we had our first conversation. And at the end of the conversation, I mean, the whole conversation is amazing too. I'm writing a memoir. I don't know if it'll be published someday, but it's part of the story. But basically at the end of the conversation, she said, good night, sweetheart. And I swear, Simon, I had heard her voice before. And it just felt like she must have said that to me when I was a baby. It was just, her voice was, I absolutely knew it. So it was pretty special. And we had a relationship for 12 years until she died. I lost both my adoptive mother and my birth mother within a year of each other. Yeah. So, but we did have opportunity to know one another. Yeah. So that's the story. It was a 4-month period in time, but it completely shifted my life. And it shifted my life, but it didn't. I did find that it was still, I had to really get to know who I am without that information. Who am I when it's not defined by being an adoptee? I'm defined by a lot of different things. And it hasn't, I think it's more the loss that has affected me, that loss of my adoptive father, my loss of my birth parents. I finally found out who my birth father was just about 5 years ago, and he was deceased. So if there's a theme in my story, it's loss, and a lot of grief, and I can touch that pretty easily. Still, it's a very tender spot. Yeah.
So the part of you that's the same. Mm-hmm. That sounds on a different level to me than your birth mother and your birth parents. Or is it?
It sounds like it's on a different level.
Yeah.
The identity or my relationships with them.
Yeah. You talk about different, our identity on different levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's that who are you connected to genetically? It's, what's your nationality and lineage of ancestors? That's all part of your identity. But I do believe that we all have a soul, and I don't think adoptees are different. I think every human being has a soul, and that's my particular belief, is that we come into this world for a reason, and our life is about figuring out what that reason is. And that's what I do in career coaching. I really try to help my clients determine their purpose. And I think it's a journey of understanding what that is. But this was a cataclysmic kind of experience in my journey. It was definitely a big shock. But I do think there's something about in my soul. I also know that I belong. I know that I'm loved. I know that I'm lovable. In my soul, I know that. Sometimes on the outside, I don't. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. But I do believe we come into this world as really pure spirits, and being adopted was a circumstance of my birth.
Yeah.
But not, it's not my soul. It's not who I am. It's how I came to be. It was my parents' experience, actually. It's more about their experience.
So you said when we spoke last month or the month before that the soul is shaded. I think it was you.
I don't remember saying that. I'm sorry.
I don't remember that.
No, I'm not sure what I was speaking of at that time. But
okay, let's go back then, because you said you've used the word soul and spirit. Is there a difference between those two? Do you use those what's the posh word, synonymously? Yeah,
synonymously, right? Yes, I believe we have a spirit, and I believe that's, I guess now I'm about to turn 70, so maybe I think about this more than I ever have. Of that, someday this body will not be here. Someday this body will die. But do I die? My ego and my identity in the world in this lifetime will die. It'll end. But I do believe my soul goes on. That's just my belief, and I don't expect your listeners to all agree with this by any means. But it's what that belief, that solid belief that was there before this happened, was also what got me through it.
Yeah.
It helped me understand. And I think being 37 gave me a different perspective than it would have been if I had known when I was 3 and lived with the identity of being adopted my whole life. Instead, I had this identity crisis because I had a different identity that was altered significantly in the process. And I needed to find my new identity. And knowing that I may never know my whole identity. That may be my course in life. But I feel really fortunate that has, even 5 years ago, still unveiled itself through DNA. And to know that I'm half Croatian on my father's side was a pretty wonderful gift for turning 65.
Yeah. Have you been to Croatia?
Not yet, but I plan to do it. I'll be retiring next year, and that's first on my list.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful country.
It is.
And and I think it's also that there's something profound in, now that we have DNA tests. I was able to see my grandparents' names, and my father was named after his father. My mom said all she could remember was his name was Ricky, and he had black curly hair, and he worked on a train. That's where she met him. He was a train conductor. And here, when the DNA results came up on the page, there was a picture of him smiling at me in a tuxedo. and it was Joseph Richard Umich II, which of course would be why he would go by Ricky, instead. My half sister has told me that he never went by Ricky, he went by Rick or Joe, but my mom remembered him as Ricky. So, but then you see your grandparents, and they both came over on a boat to Chicago. They were immigrants to the US. And that's a story that's pretty cool. And I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for ancestry.com. It would have gone to the grave.
So how do these two things kind of fit together? The soul stroke spirit part of the identity and the lineage part of the identity?
Well, I think that's all a story that, it's my story, right? It's my grandparents are from Croatia, your grandparents are from somewhere else. That's the story and the narrative of that, I've inherited. But again, I guess it's what we do with it. That how much does it define us? How much do we, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have the answers to everything on this assignment. I wish I did. I have more questions than I have answers, but I think for me, it felt really good to know the answer of what my half lineage is that I didn't know. And when my birth mother died, I thought I may never know it. So I don't know. I think it gives me something to be proud of. It maybe makes me feel whole in some way. It's the missing piece of the puzzle. I know this is not anything new, but adoptees really often talk about our pieces of ourselves that we have to put back together. And I think we have to determine how much those pieces define who we are and how it's going to affect us, and how much they're just facts, they're pieces of the puzzle. And fundamentally, it doesn't change me. I think you have to discern that for yourself. Yeah. I remember feeling my son used to make Legos, played with Legos and would make big, intricate structures as a kid. And then he'd say, "Look at this, Mom." And I'd look at it and I'm admiring it and all that. And then he'd take his hand and he'd just knock his structure down. And all these Lego pieces would be all over the floor. And that was the metaphor that came to me when I found out I was adopted. That's what it felt like. There's still a part of me that's standing. I'm still here. I'm flying home like I flew out to Chicago. I'm still here. What part of me is still here? And then there's a lot of pieces scattered and maybe pieces missing that I'll need to put back together. And maybe it'll be a different structure when I put it back together. I don't know. But that analogy kind of helped me have something a framework to think about it in. And it was completely made up because at that time, I didn't have a therapist. I only saw, it was really more of a counselor for a couple of times. But in those days, there weren't adoptee competent or adoption competent therapists. So, you were really on your own.
Did you, did the soul or spirit identity, did you find that identity before or after you had reunited? Do you remember?
Oh, I don't think it was an event. I think it is extremely layered and complex, and it's over time. But when I reunited with my birth mother, yeah, there was a part of me that, let me give you an example. She was an artist. My half sisters are artists. And I was always pretty good at art, and there's this part of you that goes, okay, that gets acknowledged, like it belongs to someone, because no one else in my family was artistic. all of the things that you know about yourself that are different have, now have a reason for why they're different. And I think that's settling. I think being different and not understanding why, and finding out that other people did know why and never told you, can be pretty devastating. And at the time I never wanted to call it betrayal. But I think that was my good adoptee coming out. It was betrayal. It is betrayal. It's a choice that my adoptive parents had, but my adoptive father was gone pretty early, but my mother had. And she made that choice, and she also needed to live with that. And she did. And she, she really regretted it, but she told me at times when your life wasn't going well, I didn't want to add anything to it. At times when your life was going really well, I didn't want to change that. And so it just never seemed like the right time. So what I can't argue that. I can't change it. And it was her decision. And it would have been nice if she would have told me earlier.
Yeah.
So health wise, nothing else.
You said that as soul or spirit, you felt that you belonged, you were loved.
Oh yes.
And that you are lovable.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. I think another part of this too was the experience was with my brother. He was my only sibling, and he was 5 years older. And because of our father dying when we were so young, I think he was the male role model for me because he was the only male in the house. And he and I were so close, but couldn't be more different. And one of the most devastating parts of that is he's still my brother. I didn't know. If I didn't know I was adopted, I didn't know maybe he was too, and he doesn't know it, or maybe he's not and he doesn't know either. And that'll change our relationship. And when you have such a small family, that you're really holding on to the love that you have, because I didn't want to be without love.
Yeah.
And so my telling him was I didn't end up telling him. My mother told him that I found out, and it ended up that he knew my whole life. And when I talked to him, I said, Ray, how could you not have told me? Because we would have brother-sister fights and, really big fights and argue and all that as kids do. And I said, there were so many times you could have told me I was adopted. And just to be mean, just to get back at me. And you never did. He said, because it didn't matter, Nance. It just didn't matter. You're my sister. And that, that's really all I needed to hear. And then, when I look at it objectively, I also think, how did that change him for knowing that secret, knowing that was a family secret, and he had to hold it for all those years? What impact did that have on him? To have an adopted sister and not be able to talk openly about that. So it affects everyone. It affects everybody that we're connected to. It's pretty phenomenal. It's a life experience I never would have ever imagined was going to be mine. And yet it was. And I have to say sometimes that I'm kind of grateful that it is my experience, because it's made me much more aware of who I am. It makes me, I had to really examine my life. And I don't know if I would have ever examined it as much as I have without this being my experience. So there are There are gifts in it. I'm connected to 7 other siblings, 7 half siblings. I'm the oldest of 8 instead of the youngest of 2. It's pretty, that's a pretty bizarre shift. When you think about who you are in the world, your sibling order, you don't think about that much, but it's a big deal. And so I don't know how to be the eldest sister. I really don't. It's kind of a joke now with my half sisters. My husband will say, you need to pull the big sister card. And I can't. I have always lived as the baby of the family. So even at this age, I can't pull I've got something over you because I'm older than you. So
how did you come to this realization of belonging, being loved and being lovable? Do you remember that?
well, I think I've been working on that for a long time, on and off. And when I decided to write my memoir, I did go back to, I went to therapy for the first time, really, regarding adoption. I've been to therapy about divorce and relationships, but not for being adopted and being a late discovery adoptee. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard what late discovery that there was a term for my experience was about 5 years ago when I started working with Amy Barker, who is an adoption therapist here in the Seattle area. And she's amazing. It was when I started writing my memoir that I took the DNA test and found out who my birth father was, and never expected that because I had taken 23andMe and there was nothing. But then I took ancestry.com and all of a sudden, instantly, I know about the whole other half of my history, which is such a different experience than how it happened when I found out that I was adopted at the beginning. So that's also interesting to me, is the experience of technology and how that has changed the experience of how we experience this news. And now I know I'm really not in the boat alone. I've got lots of people with me who are going through their shockers. But anyway, Amy was the one that said, there's a name for what you've gone through. I said, no, what? She said, late discovery adoptee, LDA. You're called an LDA. And that's great because I just never had a name for it. Now I have a name. And she helped me just really think about how does it, what are the core wounds? I read Primal Wound for the first time 5 years ago. It makes so much sense to me. And it just, it's just this continued layered exploration that I think until I die, I will always have been impacted by adoption. And it's a discovery process of how and what does it mean and how does it change you? It changes you and it doesn't change you. I think that's the summary here for me.
Yeah. Sounds like a good place to bring it in. Any ideas what you'd like to call this interview, this episode?
Excuse me?
Does the name of does a name come to mind? A title for this?
Oh, for my book? For my memoir?
No, for this conversation that we've had.
Well, it's probably a lifelong exploration of who am I.
So tell me about your book.
Oh, I'm 8 chapters in, and it's been a 5-year project, and I hope this year, especially as I begin to retire, I will finally finish it. And then we'll see.
Yeah.
Honestly, Simon, I wrote it because there was no book on that shelf in Barnes and Noble for me. And I wanted there to be a book. And I had that calling in 1998 to write it. But my life circumstances didn't allow me to be able to do that. And so, it feels it still feels true that if it helped one person, and I think all adoptee authors feel this way, you know, we're not doing it to get famous or rich, but if we can help one person by sharing our experience of it, then it's really been a labor of love and it's been worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this interview.
Will you come back on when you finish? If you finish your book, will you come back on?
Definitely will. The working title right now is Reunion, which ends up being layered in a lot of different ways. So we'll see if that ends up being it, but I will definitely let you know. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, listeners, and thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
We'll speak to you again very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.